over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Rebecca Wanzo, who is Chair and Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. She's the author of The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African American Women in Sentimental Political Storytelling at SUNY Press 2009, and the just published The Content of Our Caricature, African American Comic Art and Political Belonging, which is published by New York University Press. What's up, label mate? How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Talk a little bit about how you come to this particular book, and particularly in this moment, this idea of looking at political caricature, from the standpoint of Black American artists.
Well, I mean, the book was in the making for probably over a decade, actually. I started thinking about these topics before even my first book was finished. But I do think it has particular resonance right now. I started thinking about African American comic and cartoon art when I wrote an article about Truth, Red, White, and Black, which was written by Bob Morales, and the art was from Kyle Baker. And Kyle Baker is an artist I deal with repeatedly in my book. And I was just really interested in the way that caricature works in Baker's art quite often, that he uses or deploys sub-representations that sometimes would trouble people out of context. And so I started to think, broadly speaking, about this visual vocabulary in relationship to African American creators, broadly speaking, but I focused on comic artists. So as I kept working on the book, I realized it was more and more about citizenship and also more about our reading practices, that obviously racist caricature is usually what I call visual imperialism. Like, it's this way that we have of dehumanizing, or people, the US, the West, many countries have had of dehumanizing Black people and many other people over the centuries. But there is something interesting about when Black artists use it to try to comment on that history. And I think that sometimes we just immediately say, oh, if we have this representation, that's just a stereotype or caricature, and there's no place for it in our visual vocabulary as Black creators. But Black creators have done interesting things with that. So that's what I wanted to talk about.
And it seems like that's an ongoing tension with Black satire in general, the fact that you would deploy that thing that you're supposed to resist to tell the story that you're trying to tell.
I mean, I quote Dave Chappelle, right, where he had that famous line that I want to make sure I'm dancing and not shuffling.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will read things, and often, like, there was this one editorial cartoon I start with in the book where you have Thomas Jefferson clearly, like, writing words of Declaration of Independence, and there's this horrible, like, ink blot of a caricature, saying, "Daddy, I'm cold," in the window, right, from Kyle Baker. And I presented this, and a few people said, "That's a horrible, ugly caricature. Why would you do that?" And I said, well, it's a commentary on how Jefferson, despite his commentaries on equality, how he could view even his own children, or how that kind of history of how Black people are viewed in the history of the U.S.'s discourse of equality, how they've just been excluded from it. So Black artists have done some really interesting, cutting satirical work, and also stand-up comedians, as you mentioned. And often we just want to dismiss it, but I mean, I think it puts an edge to some of the critical commentary that I think we can still need.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about process. You mentioned that a lot of you reference Kyle Baker's work a great deal, but a lot of this work that you pull out in this book is really archival stuff. What was it like, going through the archives? What kind of things did you find that you just simply couldn't bring yourself to deal with? And what were some of the challenges of doing this kind of archival work around, Black caricature?
Well, actually, there's nothing I couldn't deal with, particularly since, I often talk about bad objects. I talk about things that, like, people find ugly, disturbing. I mean, my first book was about, I talked about child murder, medical experimentation on Black women, and rape. So comparatively, this was still okay. That said, one artists that I dealt with, or a couple artists I dealt with, Larry Fuller and Richard Grass Green, did some really interesting work as Black underground comics and cartoon artists. So I wrote about this comic book called White Whore Funnies. And so that's always interesting when I present on that talk sometimes in general audiences. And it's really a comic that takes on discourses about the Black male rapist, that also has some really disturbing rape scripts at times. Also talks about, though, how white female desire doesn't necessarily mean it's anti-racist, that there could be desire for Black men and still racism. And Larry Fuller just wrote this wonderful short oral history for me, talking about his work in the Black underground comics industry. And he talked about how when he showed up at a convention and this white reporter said, "So who's behind this?" And he said, "Well, I am." He said, No. Who wrote it?" He said, "No, I am." "No, who produced it?" Because they just couldn't believe that a Black man had a satirical gaze, and he was actually told that by a leading figure as well in the underground movement. So even though they produce some things that are really disturbing, they also do some really fascinating, edgy stuff. And I want to think about how you balance out the relationship between the things that we have to say, okay, there's nothing we really can do with this, but some stuff, there's things that are problematic, but still really rich and thoughtful and important artwork to preserve, and histories and commentaries.
You know, one of the things I think it's interesting that you talk about the way that some Black artists will use Black caricature really as a way to flip white caricature, you know, in the same kind of moment. Talk a little bit about that for the audience.
Well, one of the things I'm interested in is that we think about caricature as always negative, but when I started doing this work, I thought, well, we have tons of caricatures that are ideal in the United States. Superman, for example, Little Orphan Annie. And I particularly was interested in Little Orphan Annie as this anti-New Deal, anti-FDR cartoon. A lot of people don't know that it's one of the first explicitly political strips in the US. And so no matter what happened to her, I mean, she was homeless, you know, she was, you know, pursued by these horrible people, starving. She's like, oh, you know, things will be okay. And I started to get so irritated the more I read the strips. And what's interesting is you look at political cartoonists like Ollie Harrington or Brandon Jr., they really are pushing back against this kind of optimism and really what Lauren Berlant would call infantile citizenship that we often see in the figure of the idealized white child. So Black infantile citizens in these comics are ones that really push against the idea that they're protected by the state. They are not allowed to be innocent the way that someone like Little Orphan Annie can be. So knowing that, say that, or like the Ideal Soldier, or the various other kinds of contexts in which there are idealized white caricatures and Black people aren't allowed to be in part of that kind of idealized imaginary, a lot of my work is about showing how these cartoonists were pushing back against these idealized white archetypes, and how these idealized archetypes are ways to exclude Black people from being able to represent the US or being considered citizens.
You mentioned a little bit earlier kind of the connective tissue with some of the themes and texts that you looked at in your first book and what you're looking at now. And I always have to figure there has to be a backstory here. What is it about this kind of work, on the one hand, obviously with the caricature piece, but also really to be willing to engage not difficult subject matter, right? Stuff that's not easy, an easy flow, if you will, for readers or audiences. You know, what was your personal stake in looking at these particular texts?
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in, let's just say that my work is always about the relationship between representation, politics, and identity. And so with my first book, I was focused on African-American women and girls. And as I continued to do work on this book, it became more and more apparent to me that this was more about models of Black masculinity. Part of that's about the archive and who the cartoonists were, and the kind of aesthetics they used. And I think that trying to deal with the ugly and how you make palatable or refuse to make palatable the ugly is very interesting to me. For many years, I've taught Carol Walker, and you know, students always have such varied responses to her work, and sometimes they're heated debates about people who love her and people who say that just shouldn't be in the world. And I think that with my first book, people also dismiss sentimentality, but what I would say is like sentimentality clearly has a use. I mean, what social movement hasn't made use of the sentimental to get political work done, right? So similarly, I think we can think about looking at ugly histories and thinking about the aesthetics of that project as something that has a lot of value for us in thinking about our Black cultural production or practices of Black cultural production.
Yeah, and I'm at the point now, I'm beginning to read Sharice Smith's new collection on the work of Michael Ray Charles, who's done this very interesting work around these same kind of themes. We're in this moment where we have a president who's been so richly caricatured, and in some ways it's like his only gift to us. Do you see a kind of a correspondent energy coming from Black cartoonists to kind of meet the challenge of the moment of the Trump era?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting is I think that the kind of excesses that Trump gives us, and they are excesses indeed, is that if you look at people like Keith Knight, Black cartoonists have always seen the excesses of US racism, and that's what it's done. And so part of what I think disturbingly what Trump has done is he's made these things so visible. Right. So in some ways, this is nothing new for Black cartoonists who've been like, yes, white racism is a monstrosity. Right. I'm actually working on a essay right now about the relationship between Black cartoonists and the Black sort of high art tradition, because there are a number of people who moved from cartooning to being interested or fine artists, and we often forget those histories. But there's like one cartoonist who often used horror movie tropes in his editorial cartoons to depict racism, right? Like Nosferatu, Frankenstein, right? These demons. And, I mean, I think that part of what we have to understand about racism is that even if something seems like new and out of time, it's always, there have been changes and there's progress and there are various things have happened, but this is not linear. And cartoonists have always shown these excesses that are just hyper visible right now.
Switch gears just a little bit. We're in this moment, of course, of COVID and the Breonna Taylor, George Floyd moment, for lack of a better way to describe it. And we've seen an uptick in institutions, in companies, everyday folks who are desiring reading lists for anti-racism and want anti-racism workshops. You, of course, are now chairing a women, gender, and sexuality department. Your work fits firmly within the context of what we would describe as Black studies. How do you read this moment where folks seem to be looking elsewhere for anti-racist narratives when we do, in fact, have this body of work, in Black studies and ethnic studies that has actually been doing this work, for more than 5 decades?
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question because on one hand, a lot of us have been really, really busy this fall with a lot of invitations. On the other hand, it's very clear that there's certain kinds of text, and they'll just say like maybe the text that shall not be named, that was very, very common, and lots of corporations put the speaker in, and just a lot of money gone, towards the speaker, and that's their gig. That's fine. But I think, as we see also with these attacks on critical race theory, that there are really complicated histories that we as scholars in Black studies know we have to bring to bear on this, right? We have really, we have ways of talking about things that mean that you can't have easy solutions and that you have to really push against the move to just say, and this goes back to my first book, I feel your pain and now things will be better, right? And so I think that the kind of work we do is sometimes challenging for people to recognize in terms of how it translates. And the irony of that being that we are professors, right? The idea of being professorial somehow through the work of the right has been made to mean that you can't speak in some kind of everyday way, but we teach. Of course we can. That's what we do every time we go in the class.
Right.
And so I think, though, that the complexity that we bring to bear on these questions is something that a lot of spaces that are looking for diversity training are not really ready for.
What are you looking at in terms of projects going forward?
Oh, I have so many. I was asked, there's a new series at Rutgers on Black film, and I've been slowly working on a short book about Black Panther, the film. And so I also have a book that's in process about Black fan studies, and basically about Black love objects and really when they fail us. So it builds on some other work I've done. There was an essay called African American Act of Fandom and Other Strangers, as well as a book I wrote about Bill Cosby and various African American celebrities who've been accused of sexual violence and why that's considered really injurious, just the idea that it could be true, and what we do with that as people whose identities are often really shaped by our love for these people. Right. So that's a book I'm working on. And long term, I've been thinking for a long time, and I know when this might probably be my last book, a book on civil rights temporalities, which is about the ways in which when you look at the law, it's always telling stories about the nexus of identity and rights and time, and often fictions, like they're just making things up. So Roe v. Wade, for example, there's all kinds of things about temporality that they think true or isn't true. Plessy v. Ferguson, in that famous dissent, it says, the Constitution is colorblind, but right after that, he said white people are going to be the supreme race for all time, or just all the deliberate speed and Brown. Well, what did that mean? So I'm really interested in that in relationship to our popular understandings of the Constitution and progress, and how we tell stories and how that's embedded in popular culture about the idea that we'll always move forward to a more just future.
Thank you. We've been joined today by Professor Rebecca Wanzo, who is the author of the recently published book, The Content of Our Caricature, African American Comic Art and Political Belonging, published by New York University Press. Also the author of The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African American Women and Sentimental Political Storytelling, which was published by SUNY Press 2009. Professor Wanzo is a Duke University PhD, and she is currently the chair and professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for your time, Professor Wanzo.
Thank you for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.